On the morning of June 3rd, 1983, a 1978 Chevrolet Impala rolled into Frank's Auto Service in McLean, Virginia, with what the driver described as a persistent knocking sound coming from somewhere in the engine compartment. The shop sat on a commercial strip just off Old Dominion Drive, wedged between a dry cleaner and a hardware store, the kind of independent garage that survived on repeat customers and word-of-mouth recommendations in an area increasingly dominated by dealership service centers. The mechanic who took the work order was a 52-year-old man named Frank Castellano, and he had been running the shop for nearly 20 years. What he would discover over the course of that routine repair would expose a Soviet intelligence operation that had been running successfully in the Washington suburbs for more than 6 years, compromise a communication network that stretched from Northern Virginia to New York, and ultimately lead to the arrest of 4 individuals and the deportation of 2 Soviet diplomats who would be declared persona non grata before the summer ended. Frank Castellano had opened his shop in 1964 after spending 12 years working for various garages around the Washington area. He'd learned the trade in the Army, working as a mechanic at Fort Belvoir during his service from 1951 to 1954, and he'd come back to civilian life with skills that translated directly into steady employment. By the early 1980s, Frank's Auto Service had developed a solid reputation. The shop was clean, the prices were fair, and Frank himself had a straightforward manner that customers appreciated. He didn't oversell repairs, didn't invent problems that didn't exist, and he took pride in diagnosing issues that other mechanics had missed or misidentified. His clientele was a mix of local residents, federal employees who worked in the area, and the occasional diplomat or embassy staff member whose vehicles needed service and who had been referred by other customers. The driver of the Chevrolet Impala was a man who identified himself as David Brenner. He was approximately 40 years old, well-dressed in business casual attire, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and a slight accent that Frank couldn't quite place. Eastern European, possibly, though the man's English was fluent and his manner entirely American in its directness. Brenner explained that the knocking sound had started about a week earlier, that it seemed to be worse when the engine was cold, and that he'd checked the oil level himself and it seemed fine. He asked how long the repair might take, and Frank told him he'd need to put the car up on the lift and take a look, that it could be anything from a loose heat shield to something more serious with the engine mounts or internal components. Brenner said he'd wait if it wouldn't take more than an hour, and Frank told him he'd do his best. Frank pulled the Impala into the service bay and raised it on the hydraulic lift. The knocking sound Brenner had described was real enough. Frank had heard it during the brief test drive he'd taken around the block before bringing the car into the shop. It was a rhythmic metallic sound that seemed to come from the front of the engine, occurring primarily at idle and diminishing once the RPMs increased. His initial assessment was that it was most likely related to the timing chain, or possibly a worn bearing, but he wanted to check the simpler possibilities first before tearing into the engine. He started with the obvious external components, checking the fan, the alternator, the power steering pump, anything that might be loose or misaligned. Everything seemed secure. He moved to the heat shields, the thin metal plates that protected various components from exhaust heat and that were notorious for coming loose and rattling. Still nothing. The sound was definitely internal to the engine, which meant this was going to be more involved than a quick fix. Frank lowered the car back down and opened the hood, beginning the process of removing the valve covers to inspect the timing chain and valve train components. It was while removing the air cleaner assembly, a routine first step in accessing the top of the engine, that Frank noticed something unusual. The air cleaner housing, which should have been secured with a single wing nut in the center, had been modified. Someone had drilled additional holes in the base plate and installed small machine screws in locations that served no mechanical purpose. The modification was subtle enough that it wouldn't be noticed during casual inspection, but to someone who worked on these engines regularly, it was immediately apparent as non-standard. Frank's first thought was that a previous mechanic had done some kind of amateur repair or modification, though he couldn't imagine why anyone would drill holes in an air cleaner base. He removed the entire assembly and set it on his workbench, and it was then that he noticed the weight was wrong. The housing felt heavier than it should have, noticeably so. He picked up a flashlight and examined the interior more carefully, and that's when he saw it. The inside of the air cleaner housing had been fitted with a false bottom, a metal plate that had been carefully installed to create a hidden compartment approximately 2 inches deep and running the full diameter of the circular housing. Frank stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. The compartment was accessible only by removing several of those extra screws he'd noticed, which were actually securing the false bottom in place. His mind ran through possible explanations. Drug smuggling was the first thing that came to mind, though hiding contraband in an air cleaner seemed impractical given how often that component might need service. Then he thought about the customer, about the slight accent, about the fact that McLean was home to numerous government agencies and diplomatic facilities, about the fact that this was 1983 and the Cold War was very much ongoing. Frank had never been the paranoid type. He'd lived through McCarthyism in the 1950s and had watched the country tear itself apart over Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, and he generally maintained a healthy skepticism about both government and conspiracy theories. But he also read the newspaper, and he knew that Soviet spies were a real thing, that they operated in Washington, that they needed ways to communicate and pass information. And he was looking at what appeared to be a professionally constructed hidden compartment in a vehicle owned by a man with an Eastern European accent who was waiting in his customer lounge right now. Frank made a decision. He walked to his office, closed the door, and called the number for the FBI's Washington field office that was listed in the phone book. He asked to speak to someone about a potential security matter, was transferred twice, and eventually reached a duty agent named Robert Chen. Frank explained who he was, where his shop was located, and what he'd just found. He described the customer, the vehicle, and the hidden compartment. Agent Chen asked Frank to stay on the line, and after a brief hold, came back and told Frank that he needed to act completely normally, that agents were being dispatched to his location immediately, and that under no circumstances should he let the customer leave with the vehicle or indicate that anything unusual had been discovered. Frank hung up and walked back into the service bay. His hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed him because he prided himself on staying calm under pressure. He forced himself to focus on the work, to maintain the routine. He called out to his assistant, a 19-year-old kid named Tommy, who handled basic oil changes and tire work, and told him to take his break early. He wanted Tommy out of the shop before whatever was about to happen happened. Then Frank walked to the customer lounge, where David Brenner was sitting with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. Frank told Brenner that he'd identified the source of the knocking sound, that it was related to the timing chain, and that he'd need to order a part that wouldn't arrive until Monday. It was Friday afternoon, and Frank explained that the repair would take several hours once he had the part, so it would be best if Brenner could leave the car over the weekend and pick it up early the following week. Brenner's expression tightened slightly, a flash of something that might have been concern or suspicion, but then he nodded and asked if Frank could call him a taxi. Frank said he'd be happy to, stepped into his office, and dialed the number Agent Chen had given him instead. He was told the taxi was already on the way and that Brenner should be allowed to leave normally. 20 minutes later, after Brenner had departed in what was actually an unmarked FBI vehicle driven by an agent, posing as a cab driver, 3 more agents arrived at Frank's auto service. Agent Chen was among them, along with 2 others who identified themselves as Special Agents Morrison and Keating. They asked Frank to walk them through exactly what he'd found, and Frank showed them the air cleaner housing with its hidden compartment. The agents photographed it extensively, then carefully removed the false bottom using tools from Frank's shop. Inside the compartment was a waterproof package wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. The agents opened it carefully, documenting each step, and what they found confirmed Frank's suspicion. There were 4 rolls of undeveloped 35mm film, the kind used in cameras but specially formatted for document photography. There was a handwritten note with a series of numbers and letters that appeared to be some kind of code or reference system, and there was a small piece of paper with typed instructions that read, in English, "Maintain schedule. Next service window, July 15/20. Confirm via secondary protocol." The FBI agents spent the next 3 hours at Frank's shop. They examined the Impala thoroughly, finding no other hidden compartments but documenting everything about the vehicle. They ran the license plate and registration, which came back to a David Brenner with an address in Arlington, though the agent's expression suggested they already knew this would be a dead end. They interviewed Frank in detail about his interaction with Brenner, about how often the customer had brought his car in for service, about anything Frank could remember about previous visits. This was when Frank realized that David Brenner had been a regular customer for approximately 18 months. The man brought his car in roughly every 6 to 8 weeks for routine service, oil changes, tire rotations, minor repairs, always paying in cash, always polite but not particularly talkative. Frank pulled his service records, and the agents made copies of every work order associated with Brenner's vehicle. Looking at the pattern now with the benefit of hindsight, it seemed clear that these weren't just routine maintenance visits. The intervals were too regular, too precise. Brenner was using Frank's shop as a drop site, using his own vehicle as the transfer mechanism. The FBI agents explained to Frank, in broad terms, what they believed was happening. The Impala was serving as a mobile dead drop, a way of transferring information between a source who had access to classified materials and a handler who would collect that information and pass it along to Soviet intelligence. The system was elegant in its simplicity. The source, whoever that was, would somehow gain access to Brenner's vehicle, probably while it was parked in a specific location at a specific time, and would place packages of film or documents into the hidden compartment. Brenner would then take the vehicle to Frank's shop for routine service, claiming some minor problem that required the car to be left for a few hours or overnight. While the vehicle was at the shop, a second person, probably another Soviet operative, would enter the shop after hours and retrieve the material from the hidden compartment, replacing it with instructions or payment or whatever needed to pass in the other direction. Frank asked the obvious question: how was someone getting into his shop after hours without him knowing? Agent Chen explained that it probably wasn't difficult. Commercial locks were notoriously easy to pick, and a trained intelligence officer could be in and out in minutes without leaving obvious signs of entry. Frank thought about the handful of times over the past year and a half when he'd arrived in the morning to find small things slightly out of place, a door he remembered locking that was unlocked, tools that weren't quite where he'd left them. He'd dismissed these as his own forgetfulness or his assistant's carelessness, but now they took on a different significance. The FBI made the decision to set a trap. They would keep Brenner's vehicle at the shop as planned, but they would install surveillance equipment and station agents nearby to observe who came to access the hidden compartment. Frank was instructed to maintain his normal routine, to open and close the shop at his usual times, and to tell anyone who asked that the Impala was waiting for a part and would be picked up the following week. The agents were particularly interested in the note they'd found, the reference to a July service window, which was approximately 6 weeks away. They wanted to run this operation long enough to identify not just the person who serviced the dead drop, but potentially the source who was providing the classified information. That evening, after the FBI agents had left and Frank had closed up the shop, he sat in his office and tried to process what had happened. In the span of a single afternoon, his quiet garage had become the center of a counterintelligence operation. He thought about all the times David Brenner had sat in his customer lounge, reading a newspaper, drinking coffee, chatting pleasantly about the weather or the Redskins. Had any of it been real, or was every interaction calculated, every word chosen to maintain a cover? Frank had been in the army during Korea, had done his service, had come home and built a life that was deliberately normal and uncomplicated, and now 3 decades later, the Cold War had arrived in his service bay in the form of a 1978 Chevrolet with a hidden compartment in its air cleaner. The surveillance operation began the following Monday. FBI technicians installed miniature cameras in Frank's shop, carefully hidden in locations that would capture anyone entering after hours. They placed sensors on the doors and windows that would alert a monitoring team if anyone attempted entry. They set up observation posts in nearby buildings, positions from which agents could watch the shop 24 hours a day without being detected. Frank was given a direct number to call if anything unusual happened during business hours, if Brenner returned unexpectedly, if anyone showed unusual interest in the Impala or started asking questions about it. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The shop operated normally during the day. Frank serviced the vehicles of his regular customers, maintained his routine, tried not to think about the cameras watching him work or the agents monitoring his every move. At night, the shop sat dark and empty, and the surveillance team watched and waited. Several times people walked past on the sidewalk, and once a drunk college student tried the front door handle before stumbling away, but there were no attempts to enter, no indication that anyone was interested in the Impala sitting in the service bay. Then, on the night of June 21st, at approximately 2:35 in the morning, the sensors on the back door of Frank's shop registered that someone had picked the lock. The FBI's monitoring team, stationed in a van 3 blocks away, immediately alerted the tactical unit that was prepared to move in if necessary. But the decision was made to observe rather than intercept, to let whoever was entering complete their task and leave, and then to follow them and see where they went. The surveillance cameras inside the shop captured everything. A figure entered through the back door, moving quickly but carefully, using a small flashlight to navigate. The person was dressed entirely in dark clothing, face partially obscured by a hat, and the upturned collar of a jacket. They went directly to the Impala, opened the hood with practiced efficiency, and removed the air cleaner housing. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. They opened the hidden compartment, removed something that appeared to be a small envelope, replaced it with something else, reassembled the air cleaner, closed the hood, and departed the same way they'd entered. FBI agents waiting outside tracked the figure to a vehicle parked 2 blocks away, a nondescript sedan with diplomatic plates. The driver was a woman, approximately 35 years old, and she drove directly back to an apartment building in Northwest Washington that FBI counterintelligence had been monitoring for other reasons. The building housed several Soviet diplomatic personnel, and the woman was quickly identified as Svetlana Kuznetsova, a cultural affairs officer at the Soviet embassy, who was suspected of being a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. The FBI now had confirmation that the dead drop was active and that it was being serviced by Soviet intelligence, but they still didn't know who the source was, the person providing the classified information that was being passed through Brenner's vehicle. The operation continued. The FBI carefully documented what Kuznetsova had left in the hidden compartment, a small package that contained $2,000 in cash and a handwritten note with more coded instructions. They photographed everything, then carefully replaced it exactly as they'd found it. 2 days later, on June 23rd, David Brenner returned to Frank's auto service. He told Frank he was checking on the status of his vehicle, whether the part had arrived yet. Frank, following the script the FBI had prepared for him, explained that there had been a delay with the supplier, but that the part should arrive by the end of the week. Brenner accepted this with apparent patience, said he'd check back in a few days, and left. The FBI was now certain that Brenner's role was simply as a facilitator, that he maintained the vehicle and ensured it was available at the right times, but that he probably wasn't directly involved in the intelligence gathering. The breakthrough came from a different direction entirely. The FBI had been analyzing the service records from Frank's shop, looking at every vehicle that had been serviced during the times when Brenner's car was also there, trying to identify patterns. They found one, a 1981 Ford Granada, registered to a man named Thomas Whitmore, had been brought in for service on at least 6 occasions over the past 18 months, and every single time, Brenner's Impala had also been at the shop, either being serviced simultaneously or picked up within hours of each other. Thomas Whitmore was 38 years old and worked as a technical specialist at the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, Maryland. He held a top-secret security clearance with special access to signals intelligence programs, exactly the kind of position that would make him a valuable target for Soviet recruitment. Background checks revealed that Whitmore had significant personal debt, approximately $40,000 in credit card bills and medical expenses related to his wife's cancer treatment, which had bankrupted them despite insurance. He fit the classic profile of someone who might be vulnerable to financial inducement. The FBI initiated surveillance on Whitmore on June 25th. They watched him drive to work each morning at NSA, observed his routine, documented his movements. They obtained authorization to monitor his phone calls and to review his financial records in detail. What they found was a pattern of cash deposits, irregular amounts ranging from $1,000 to $3,000, deposited into his checking account every 6 to 8 weeks, going back approximately 18 months. When questioned by his bank about the source of these deposits, Whitmore had claimed they were payments from freelance technical writing work he did on the side, but the FBI could find no evidence of any such work, no clients, no contracts, no publication of any articles or manuals. On July 2nd, FBI agents observed Thomas Whitmore arrive at Frank's auto service at 9:30 in the morning with his Ford Granada, telling Frank that the car was making a strange noise and asking if Frank could take a look. David Brenner's Impala was already at the shop, having been dropped off the previous evening with a claim that it was running rough. The FBI surveillance team watched as Whitmore sat in the customer lounge for approximately 15 minutes, during which time Frank and his assistant Tommy were both in the service bay working on other vehicles. At some point during those 15 minutes, according to the FBI's later reconstruction, Whitmore had walked back into the service area, ostensibly to use the restroom or to check on his vehicle, and had placed a package into the hidden compartment of Brenner's Impala. The decision to make arrests was made that afternoon at FBI headquarters. They had observed what appeared to be an active transfer of classified material. They had identified the source and at least 2 members of the support network, and they had sufficient evidence to move forward with charges. The risk of waiting longer was that Whitmore might become suspicious, that the network might realize they were under surveillance, that critical intelligence might be passed to Moscow before they could intervene. On the morning of July 3, 1983, FBI agents executed arrest warrants at 3 locations simultaneously. Thomas Whitmore was arrested at his home in Laurel, Maryland at 6 a.m. David Brenner was arrested at his apartment in Arlington at the same time, and Svetlana Kuznetsova was taken into custody at the Soviet embassy, though as a diplomatic officer she would ultimately be declared persona non grata and expelled from the country rather than prosecuted. A 4th individual, a man named Peter Volkov, who worked as a Soviet trade representative and who was identified as Brenner's handler, was also arrested and subsequently deported. The search of Whitmore's home produced the evidence that would seal his conviction. Hidden in his basement, behind a panel in the ceiling tiles, agents found a 35mm camera equipped with a macro lens suitable for document photography, several rolls of exposed but undeveloped film, and a notebook containing what appeared to be a record of classified documents he had accessed and photographed over the previous 18 months. The documents covered a range of signals, intelligence programs, encryption systems, and surveillance capabilities that represented some of NSA's most closely guarded secrets. The search of Brenner's apartment found evidence of his role as a cutout, including keys to Frank's auto service that he had apparently obtained by having copies made from impressions, instructions written in Russian about servicing schedules and communication protocols, and approximately $15,000 in cash hidden in various locations throughout the apartment. Most damning was a Soviet passport in Brenner's real name, Dmitry Sokolov, showing he was a KGB officer who had entered the United States on a false identity in 19. Frank's auto service became the subject of intense FBI scrutiny for several weeks following the arrests. Agents interviewed every customer whose vehicle had been at the shop during the 18-month period of the operation, trying to determine if anyone else had been involved or if any other vehicles had been compromised. They examined Frank's financial records, his background, his associations, looking for any indication that he had been complicit in the operation. They found nothing. Frank Castellano was exactly who he appeared to be, an honest mechanic who had stumbled onto an espionage operation purely by chance while trying to diagnose an engine knock. The trial of Thomas Whitmore began in October 1983 in federal court in Baltimore. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming, built on the physical evidence found in his home, the surveillance documentation of his meetings with Brenner, the financial records showing unexplained cash deposits, and the testimony of FBI agents who had monitored the operation. Whitmore's defense attorney argued that his client had been entrapped, that he had been targeted because of his financial vulnerabilities, that the Soviets had exploited his desperation to pay for his wife's medical care. But the evidence of voluntary participation was clear. Whitmore had initiated contact with Soviet intelligence, had actively sought out the relationship, had been photographing documents for more than a year before the FBI discovered the operation. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. In January 1984, Thomas Whitmore was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison for espionage. He would ultimately serve 23 years before being released on parole in 2007. David Brenner, whose real identity as Dmitry Sokolov was confirmed through fingerprint analysis and cooperation from British intelligence services that had encountered him in a previous posting, pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a 15-year sentence, though he would serve only 7 years before being exchanged in a spy swap in 1990. Frank's auto service continued operating through the rest of the 1980s, though Frank would later admit that the espionage case changed something fundamental about how he viewed his work and his customers. The easy trust he'd always extended, the assumption that people were who they claimed to be, had been replaced by a certain wariness. He found himself studying customers more carefully, wondering about their stories, questioning details that he would have previously accepted without thought. It wasn't paranoia exactly, just an awareness that the world contained layers of deception that most people never encountered, and that occasionally those layers intersected with ordinary life in unexpected ways. The FBI conducted a damage assessment to determine what classified information had been compromised through Whitmore's espionage. The assessment, which remained classified for years and has only been partially declassified since, concluded that Whitmore had provided the Soviets with detailed information on at least 15 signals intelligence programs, including technical specifications for satellite communications intercept systems, details about NSA's cryptanalytic capabilities against Soviet military codes, and information about the locations and operations of signals intelligence collection sites around the world. The damage was described as severe but not catastrophic. The programs Whitmore had compromised were modified or replaced, the collection sites were relocated or reconfigured, and the intelligence advantage the Soviets had gained was gradually neutralized through operational changes. What made the case particularly significant, from a counterintelligence perspective, was not just what was caught, but how it was caught. The FBI had been aware of a leak at NSA, had known that classified information was making its way to Soviet hands, but had been unable to identify the source through traditional investigative methods, background checks, polygraph examinations, financial reviews. None of these had flagged Thomas Whitmore as a risk. It was only through the chance discovery by a civilian mechanic, followed by patient surveillance and careful analysis, that the source was identified and the operation was dismantled. The hidden compartment in the Impala's air cleaner became something of a legend within the FBI's counterintelligence division, an example of the kind of creative tradecraft that foreign intelligence services employed and that required constant vigilance to detect. The case was used in training for new agents, demonstrating how espionage operations often hid in plain sight, how they exploited everyday activities and locations, and how the most mundane details could be indicators of something more significant. For Frank Castellano, the espionage case brought a brief period of public attention that he found deeply uncomfortable. Local news covered the story, reporters called his shop asking for interviews, and for a few weeks he was known as the mechanic who had caught a spy. But Frank refused to give interviews, declined to discuss the case beyond what was required for the prosecution, and generally tried to return to the quiet anonymity he had always preferred. He continued running his shop until 1995, when he sold the business to his assistant Tommy, who by then was 31 years old and had learned everything Frank could teach him about engines and about paying attention to details that didn't quite fit. The case raised questions that extended beyond the specific facts of this particular espionage operation. Questions about how many other dead drops might be operating in similar fashion, using businesses and vehicles and everyday locations as transfer points. Questions about the vulnerability of places like auto repair shops, dry cleaners, storage facilities, any location where people routinely left property for extended periods and where access could be gained with minimal suspicion. The FBI quietly reached out to business owners in sensitive areas around Washington, providing general guidance about security awareness without disclosing the specific details of how the Whitmore case had been broken. Thomas Whitmore, in his later years in prison and after his eventual release, never spoke publicly about his motivations or his actions. He granted no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and maintained a silence that left many questions unanswered. Why had he betrayed his country? Was it purely financial desperation, or had there been ideological motivations as well? How had he been recruited? What had his relationship with his Soviet handlers been like? These questions remained largely unanswered, preserved only in classified debriefing reports and psychological assessments that will likely remain sealed for decades to come. Dmitry Sokolov returned to the Soviet Union as part of a 1990 prisoner exchange and disappeared from Western awareness. Reports from former intelligence officers who defected in later years suggested that Sokolov was considered a successful officer who had run an effective operation until it was compromised through circumstances beyond his control. The fact that a civilian mechanic had noticed the hidden compartment was apparently viewed within the KGB not as a failure of operational security but as bad luck, the kind of random chance that could defeat even the most carefully planned intelligence operation. The 1978 Chevrolet Impala itself was held as evidence throughout the trial and subsequent appeals, then was eventually sold at a government auction in 1986. The new owner, according to records from the General Services Administration, was a used car dealer in Baltimore who had no idea of the vehicle's history, whether the car still exists somewhere, perhaps still on the road with its hidden compartment intact, or perhaps long since junked and crushed into a cube of scrap metal, is unknown. Frank's Auto Service closed in 1995, and the building was eventually demolished in 2003 to make way for a condominium development. The site where Frank Castellano discovered a Soviet espionage operation while trying to diagnose an engine knock is now occupied by luxury apartments, and the residents who live there have no idea that their building sits on a small piece of Cold War history. There is no historical marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate that anything significant ever happened at that location, which is entirely appropriate for an intelligence operation that succeeded precisely because it was hidden in the most ordinary of places. The story of how a routine auto repair exposed a Soviet espionage scheme remains one of those Cold War cases that demonstrates the essential randomness that could determine the outcome of intelligence operations. All the training, all the tradecraft, all the careful planning could be undone by a mechanic who noticed that an air cleaner weighed more than it should. In the vast secret war between superpowers, with its satellites and code-breaking computers and sophisticated surveillance systems, sometimes the most important discoveries came from someone who simply paid attention to details and trusted their instincts when something didn't seem quite right. Frank Castellano died in 2008 at the age of 77. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of the espionage case, describing him simply as a longtime local businessman and Army veteran. But within the FBI's counterintelligence division, his name was remembered as an example of how civilian awareness and attention to detail could contribute to national security in ways that professionals with all their resources and training sometimes could not achieve. The case file remains partially classified, with certain details about intelligence sources and methods still protected, but the essential story has become part of the historical record, a reminder that the Cold War was fought not just by spies and agents, but sometimes by ordinary people who found themselves, quite by accident, standing at the intersection of everyday life and international espionage.